The Mafia boss pretended to be paralyzed and blind. Everyone abandoned him, except his poor maid and two little kids. Nobody ever thought a man like Dominic would end up sitting in a wheelchair, staring at nothing, with a blanket over his lap like an old man waiting to die. That was not who he was. That had never been who he was. For more than 20 years, Dominic Ferrante ran things. Not small things. Everything. The docks on the south side of the city. The construction contracts. The loans that never came from any bank. The agreements that were never written down on paper, but that everyone in a certain circle understood and respected. He was not a man you called by a nickname unless he gave you permission. He was not a man you kept waiting. He was not a man whose phone went to voicemail. He had built something real. From almost nothing, from a small apartment above a laundry, from a father who had debts and an uncle who had contacts. He had built something that took 2 decades of careful, patient, sometimes brutal work. He was not proud of every decision he had ever made, but he was proud of the fact that when he made a decision, it held. People stayed loyal to Dominic not just because they were afraid of him, they stayed loyal because he was reliable, because he remembered things, birthdays, favors owed, promises made years ago, because if he told you he would take care of something, it got taken care of. In that world, that kind of consistency was rarer than money. So when the news spread, quietly, the way all serious news spreads in that world, that Dominic had been in an accident, that he was in hospital, that the doctors were saying he might not walk again, might not see properly again, there was a moment of genuine shock. A few people who had known him a long time felt something close to grief. That moment did not last very long. It was a Tuesday night in November when it happened. Dominic had finished a dinner meeting at a private room in a restaurant he had used for 20 years. Nothing unusual. He had eaten well, lamb, roasted vegetables, a glass of red wine he did not finish. He had shaken hands with 2 men, said his goodbyes, and walked out to the car just before 11 o'clock. His driver, a man called Enzo, who had worked for him for 9 years, was already behind the wheel. His bodyguard, a quiet man named Pietro, was in the passenger seat. Dominic sat in the back, loosened his tie, and looked out the window at the wet street. He does not remember much after that. He remembers headlights. He remembers glass. He remembers a sound like the world deciding to stop. When he woke up, 11 days had passed. Enzo did not survive. Pietro lost 2 fingers on his left hand and a significant amount of blood, but he lived. Dominic had a fracture at his temple, damage to the vision in his left eye, temporary, the doctors said, but uncertain for how long, and a spinal injury that had, for the moment, removed most feeling below his waist. The doctors were careful with their words. They said, for the moment. They said, we are monitoring. They said, recovery is possible, but we cannot make promises at this stage. Dominic listened to all of this very quietly, from a hospital bed with tubes in his arm and a bandage around his head. Then he said something that surprised everyone in the room. He said, tell people I will not walk again. Tell them I cannot see. The lead doctor looked at him carefully. Mr. Ferrante, your prognosis is uncertain. We cannot say. I know what the prognosis is, Dominic said. I am telling you what to say to other people. Tell them I am finished. Tell them it is permanent. There was a long silence. Do you understand me? Dominic asked. The doctor understood. Why did he do it? That is the question people asked later, when everything came out. Why would a man in Dominic's position, a man with power, with resources, with people who owed him, choose to pretend he was helpless? Why would he put himself in that position? The answer was simple, even if it was not easy. Dominic knew that the route his car had taken that Tuesday night was not a route anyone should have known. He changed his routes regularly. He never repeated a pattern. The 2 men he had dined with that evening had not been told the specific roads. His driver Enzo planned routes privately and shared them with no one except Pietro. Yet someone had known. 2 cars had been positioned precisely. The timing was exact. Whoever arranged it knew where he would be and at what time, within a margin of maybe 5 minutes. That meant the information came from inside, from someone very close. Dominic had been in this business long enough to know what came next. In a world built on power, the moment a powerful man appeared to fall, the people around him did not mourn. They moved. They calculated. They began quietly and quickly to figure out what they could take and how fast they could take it. He had seen it happen to others. He had, on 2 occasions, been one of the people doing the calculating. He did not intend to lie in a hospital bed and let it happen to him without knowing who was doing what. So he made a decision. He would say nothing. He would appear destroyed, and he would watch. The people who had tried to end his life believed they had gotten away with it. They believed he was broken, blind in one eye, paralyzed, finished. Let them believe it. Let them act on that belief. And then he would know exactly who they were. He was brought home 3 weeks after the attack. A wheelchair, dark glasses over his eyes, a blanket across his lap. He was helped from the car by Pietro, who was one of perhaps 3 people in the world Dominic still trusted without reservation, and brought through the front door of his own home like a man who no longer belonged there. The household staff had assembled. His wife, Juliana, stood near the staircase in a black dress, her eyes red. His underboss, a man called Renato, stood near the window with his hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully arranged into something that was supposed to look like grief, but sat slightly wrong on his face, the way an unfamiliar piece of clothing does. Other men came forward. They shook his hand. They patted his shoulder. They said the right things. Dominic said very little. He kept his eyes behind the dark glasses and his face neutral. He let people believe he was only half present, stunned, diminished, processing loss. He was, in fact, the most alert he had been in years. He noticed that Renato's watch was new, expensive, not the kind of thing you bought on an underboss's salary, even a comfortable one. He noticed that 2 of the other men exchanged a brief glance when they thought no one was looking, a glance that said something, though he could not yet read exactly what. He noticed that Juliana, when she leaned in to kiss his cheek, smelled of a cologne that was not his. He filed all of it away, and then a woman came through from the kitchen, a small brown-skinned woman in her late 50s, wearing the same plain uniform she always wore, and she said, simply and without drama, "Your room is ready. I've put extra pillows on the bed, the way the nurse said. There is soup on the stove for when you are hungry." Her name was Rosa. She had worked in his house for 11 years. She cleaned. She cooked when the regular cook was not in. She kept things in order. Dominic had probably said fewer than 200 words to her in 11 years, not out of cruelty, simply because that was how his household worked. The staff were staff. They did their work. He did his. Rosa did not cry when she saw him. She did not make a speech. She just told him his room was ready and that there was soup. Dominic nodded and was pushed toward the hallway. Something about that moment stayed with him. He did not know why, not yet. The first week was strange in a way he had not fully anticipated. He had expected to feel the loneliness of the performance, being in a room, listening, unable to respond normally. What he had not expected was how quickly the people around him stopped behaving as though he was in the room at all. It started with small things. Conversations that continued through the half-open door of his study, where he sat in the wheelchair near the window. Phone calls taken in the hallway, in voices that were only slightly lowered. Juliana spending less and less time at the house. She was visiting her sister, she told the housekeeper, almost every day. Renato came to visit on the 3rd day. He sat across from Dominic and spoke about the business in careful, vague terms, reassuring, gentle, the way you speak to a child or someone who can no longer fully understand. He said everything was being managed. He said Dominic should not worry. He said his only job right now was to rest and recover. Dominic sat behind his dark glasses and listened to the careful vagueness, and understood that Renato was not reporting to him. He was performing a report. The real conversations were happening somewhere else. After Renato left, Dominic sat alone for a long time. Then Rosa came in to tidy the room, as she did every evening. She moved quietly around the space, straightening cushions, collecting a cup that had been left on the side table, pulling the curtain slightly against the evening light. She did not speak. She did not need to. She was just doing her job. But at the door, on her way out, she paused. "Do you want me to leave the small lamp on?" she asked. "The room gets very dark by 9 o'clock." Dominic, who was supposed to be blind, said nothing. Rosa left the lamp on anyway. He did not know why that mattered to him. It was a small thing, an ordinary thing. But in a week full of people performing loyalty and performing grief, the small lamp felt more honest than anything else that had happened since he came home. His children came every evening after school. Luca was 6. Nino was 4. They were from his first marriage. Their mother, a woman called Francesca, had left the marriage 8 years ago in an arrangement that was quiet and fair, and that Dominic had managed with the same precision he applied to everything. Francesca had moved to another city. The children had stayed. That had been her decision as much as his. She had been honest about the fact that she was not built for the life he lived, but she had also been honest about the fact that she was not sure she was built for the full demands of single parenthood either. It was a complicated, imperfect situation, and both of them had made peace with it as best they could. Luca and Nino were now being cared for primarily by Rosa, which had been the case for some time, in truth, even before the accident. Rosa was the one who made sure their school bags were ready in the morning. Rosa was the one who knew which foods Nino would not eat, and which programs Luca liked to watch on Saturday mornings. When they came to see their father each evening, Rosa would sit in the corner of the room, sewing or reading or simply present, while the boys spent time with him. No one had asked her to do this. She had simply started doing it because she noticed that no one else was bothering to supervise the visits, and she did not think 2 small children should be left alone in a room with their sick father without an adult nearby. Luca was the talker. He sat on the edge of his father's bed, always the same spot, left side, near the pillow, and talked without stopping. He talked about school, about his friends, about a boy in his class who had a dog that had recently had puppies. He talked about a drawing he had done that his teacher had put on the wall. He talked about a film he had watched at a friend's house, and about a dream he had where he could fly but only sideways, which he found frustrating even in the dream. He did not seem to need his father to respond. He talked the way some children talk to the sky or to the sea, not expecting an answer, just needing to say the words out loud. Nino was quieter. He would climb into his father's lap without asking. He never asked, just appeared there, and press his ear against Dominic's chest, the way small children do when they want to feel a heartbeat. "I can hear it," Nino said one evening, referring to no further explanation. Dominic sat very still. "It sounds like a drum," Nino added, as though reporting an interesting scientific discovery. Then he was satisfied and went back to his drawing on the floor. Dominic had held still through many difficult situations in his life. He had sat across from dangerous men and shown nothing. He had received bad news without blinking. He had made hard decisions and lived with them. Holding still while his 4-year-old son listened to his heartbeat was harder than any of it. Nino drew pictures of him, many pictures. This had apparently started before the accident. He had always liked to draw, but it intensified afterward. He drew his father in the wheelchair. He drew his father sitting by the window. He drew his father at the dinner table, which had not happened yet, but which Nino seemed to believe would happen eventually. In every single drawing, Dominic was smiling. Big, round, crayon smiles, the kind that take up most of a face. Nino left these drawings on his father's bedside table, propped up against the lamp, one after another. He never said anything about them. He just put them there. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and Rosa was doing a last check of the room, she found 4 of the drawings lined up against the wall below the window. Nino had apparently rearranged them while his father was resting, creating a small gallery of sorts. Rosa looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Dominic. He was watching her from behind the dark glasses. She picked up the drawings carefully, straightened them, and placed them back on the bedside table in a neat row. "He works very hard on these," she said, not to anyone in particular. She turned off the overhead light and left the small lamp on and went out. Dominic looked at the drawings for a long time in the lamplight. A man with a big round head and tiny arms and a smile that was maybe the most inaccurate portrait of him that had ever existed. He stayed awake for a long time that night. 3 weeks in, Things began to shift. Juliana's visits became shorter and more perfunctory. She would appear in the doorway of his room, ask if he needed anything, wait approximately 45 seconds, and then remember somewhere else she needed to be. She did not sit with him. She did not read to him. She had organized a roster of nurses, private, expensive, professional, and seemed to feel that this absolved her of the need to be present herself. Dominic did not hold this against her exactly. He had known for some years that whatever had once connected them had worn down to something thinner than habit. The marriage had been, for a long time, a kind of arrangement, comfortable, functional, emotionally cautious on both sides. He was not surprised by her withdrawal. He was, perhaps, a little surprised by the speed of it. What he had not expected was the phone. He had kept his own phone, a simple, old model, hidden in a compartment built into the arm of the wheelchair, which most people assumed was just a storage space. On the 22nd day, he received a message from a number he did not recognize. The message said only, "The meeting happened. Your name was not mentioned." He understood what this meant. A formal meeting of his people, the kind that established direction, the kind that would determine who made decisions going forward, had taken place without him. His name had not been mentioned, which in the language of his world meant not that he was being protected. It meant he was already gone. He sat with this information for a day. Then he sent a reply. Who was there? Over the next several days, information came back to him in fragments. A name here, a location there. He already knew most of it, or could piece it together from what he had been observing. Renato was at the center of things. Two other men, people Dominic had promoted, people he had trusted, were going along. What surprised him was what came next. He received a second message, from a different number. This one said, "Check what they put in the evening glass." He did not understand this at first. Then that evening, Rosa brought his usual glass of water with his evening medication dissolved in it, prepared by the nurse, set on the kitchen counter, collected by whoever was nearest. Dominic looked at the glass for a long moment. Then he set it aside. The next morning he was fine. That afternoon, Pietro came to see him. Pietro, who had lost 2 fingers in the same attack that had put Dominic here, and who had quietly remained loyal in a way that cost him, because Renato's people had noticed, and Pietro handed him a small sealed envelope. Inside was a brief note, written in a hand Dominic did not recognize, that said, "The doctor who visits is not trying to help you." He already knew this. He had known it for about a week. Dr. Conti had been visiting more frequently than was medically necessary, administering injections described as vitamins that had a faint chemical smell Dominic associated with something other than vitamins. He had been pretending to sleep through the injections, keeping his arm relaxed, letting the doctor believe he was drowsy and confused. What he had not known was that someone else in the house had noticed. He found out who, on a Thursday. Rosa came in for the evening clean. She moved through the room the same way she always did, quietly, efficiently, without looking at him more than necessary. She collected the water glass from the side table. She went to the bathroom, and he heard the sound of water being poured away. When she came back, she set a fresh glass on the table, one she had clearly brought herself, from the kitchen, not the one that had been prepared by the nurse. She said nothing. She did not explain. She did not give any indication that what she had just done was out of the ordinary. She straightened the curtain and picked up a small toy of Nino's that had been left on the floor and placed it on the shelf. At the door, she paused. "Sleep well, Mr. Ferrante," she said, exactly as she always said, and she left. Dominic sat completely still for several minutes after she was gone. Rosa had no way of knowing what was in the glass she had thrown out. She had no access to medical information, no knowledge of what Dominic suspected about Dr. Conti. She had simply, at some point, noticed something. The way a woman who has spent decades taking care of other people's homes and other people's sick relatives learns to notice things that are slightly wrong, without being able to name exactly what they are. She had noticed, and she had acted on it. Quietly, without telling anyone, without asking for anything. She had been doing this, he realized, for at least a week. The glass she brought had always been from a different source than the one prepared by the nurse. He had been drinking the right glass without knowing why it was there. She had been protecting him without knowing she was being watched. Without knowing he could see her. Without any expectation that he would ever know. In Dominic's world, loyalty was currency. It was traded, earned, spent, and sometimes faked. He had spent his entire adult life calculating the loyalty of the people around him. How much was real? How much was interest-driven? How much would hold under pressure? He could not, for the life of him, calculate Rosa. She had nothing to gain. She was a maid in a house where the boss appeared to be dying. The smart move, the safe move, was to keep her head down, collect her pay for as long as it came, and start looking for her next position. Instead, she had been quietly, consistently, without any audience, taking care of him. He thought about that for a long time. 6 weeks, 7, 8. The house changed around him in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Juliana stopped pretending. She was barely there anymore, a face at the weekend, a brief appearance for the children's sake, and then gone again. She was making arrangements. Dominic understood. She was moving money, not large amounts. She was careful, or she thought she was careful, but enough to tell him what she intended. He let her. He watched and said nothing. Renato had stopped visiting. This was actually the most informative thing that had happened since Dominic came home. Renato had been coming every week, dutiful, appropriate, performing concern. And then, around the 6th week, he stopped coming. He sent a junior man in his place, a young person who clearly did not want to be there and who left as quickly as possible. This told Dominic everything he needed to know. Renato no longer felt it was necessary to keep up the performance. He was not afraid of consequences. He believed Dominic was finished. The young man he sent in his place, his name was Giulio, early 20s, awkward, apologetic, always brought a small bag of fruit for Dominic, which he left on the table with the expression of someone completing a school assignment they were embarrassed to have been given. He would stay for 10 minutes, say a few things, and go. On the 3rd visit he was leaving when he paused at the door, so long a pause that Dominic almost looked up, and then quietly placed something extra on the table, a folded piece of paper. Giulio left. Rosa, who was in the corner of the room, had seen this. She waited until she heard his car leave. Then she brought the paper to Dominic without a word. She did not open it. She did not look at him with questions. She just put it in his hand and went back to what she was doing. The note was from Giulio. It said that he was sorry, that he had been told to come and see that Dominic was still in the same condition and report back, that he did not feel right about it, that there were other men who felt the same way but who were afraid of Renato. And then it said, "We heard what they put in the glass. We were afraid to say anything. Is there anything we can do?" Dominic read the note twice. He folded it precisely. He put it in the compartment in the wheelchair arm, and for the first time in 2 months, something in his chest felt like it was pointing in a direction again. The children were the part he had not prepared for. He had known, going into this, that it would be difficult. He had known it would require patience and stillness, and the ability to watch things happen without reacting. He had done all of that. He had sat through conversations that would have made a younger version of himself stand up and do something drastic. He had watched betrayal being organized in his own home and said nothing. But the children were different. Luca, around week 8, stopped talking as much during his visits. He still came every evening. He still sat on the same spot on the bed, but he was quieter, and sometimes he just sat there and held his father's hand without saying anything. He was 6 years old, and in the way that children sometimes absorb the atmosphere of a house, even when no one explains anything to them, he had absorbed the fact that something was wrong, not just with his father's body, with the whole house. One evening he said, very quietly, "Are you still in there?" Dominic did not move, did not blink. Luca nodded slowly, as though he had received an answer. "Okay," he said, "I'm just going to stay here for a bit." And he did. He sat there for an hour, holding his father's hand, while the room got dark, and Rosa quietly came in and turned on the small lamp, and then left them alone. Dominic thought about that phrase, "Are you still in there?" for a long time afterward. Yes, he was still in there, more there than he had ever been, more aware, more present, more quietly paying attention than he had been at any point in 20 years of running things. He had been so busy running things that he had, perhaps, stopped being inside them. It took a 6-year-old boy and a room going dark to make him understand that. On a Saturday morning, 10 weeks after he had come home, something happened that he had not planned for. Rosa brought breakfast, porridge, which he was able to eat easily, and tea. She set it on the tray and straightened the curtain and was about to leave when Nino came running in from the hallway, still in his pajamas, holding a drawing. "Look," Nino said, absolutely insistent, pushing the drawing toward his father's face. "I made you standing up." Rosa stopped near the door. In the drawing, crayon, on a torn piece of paper from a school exercise book, there was a figure standing. Not sitting, not in a wheelchair, standing. Same large round head, same tiny arms, same enormous smile. "That's you," Nino said firmly, "standing up, because I think you are going to stand up." Rosa was looking at the drawing. Dominic was looking at Nino. Nino was 4 years old. He had not been told any prognosis. He had not been given any update about whether his father's condition might improve. He had simply decided, from the inside of whatever 4-year-olds use to make sense of the world, that his father was going to stand up. "I put it on the wall," Nino added, pointing at the wall beside the window, where he had already taped the drawing before coming to announce it. "So you can see it." There was a pause. Rosa turned away to look out the window. Dominic reached out very slowly and put his hand on top of Nino's head. Just for a moment. Just that. Nino seemed satisfied. He went back to the hallway to do something else. In the silence afterward, Rosa turned back from the window. She did not say anything. She picked up the tray, checked that it was steady, and walked to the door. At the door she paused. "He checks the drawing every morning," she said, "to make sure it is still there." She left. Dominic looked at the drawing on the wall for a long time. Then he looked at his hands in his lap. Then he stood up. Not completely. Not easily. His legs were not back to where they had been. The injury was real, even if the permanence had been exaggerated. He held the bedpost and got to his feet for about 30 seconds before lowering himself back down. But he stood. On his own. He had been able to do this for about 2 weeks, privately, at night, with the door shut. He had kept it to himself. But standing up in that room, with the drawing on the wall and the morning light coming through the curtain, felt like it meant something different than the nights. He sat back down, straightened the blanket, put the dark glasses back on, and began to think very carefully about what came next. The plan he made was not complicated. Dominic had never believed in complicated plans. Complicated plans had too many points where things could go wrong. Simple plans, executed carefully, with the right information and the right timing, those were the ones that held. He had spent 3 months gathering information. He knew who was with him and who was not. He knew what had happened to his interests in his absence. He knew, now, who had arranged for the doctor to come and help him. He knew a great deal. The person who had given away the route on the night of the attack had been careful. They had not been careful enough. A conversation had happened, in a restaurant owned by one of Dominic's old contacts, between 2 people who did not realize that the man clearing the tables nearby had worked for Dominic's family since before either of them was born. That man had remembered what he heard. He had waited, because he was not sure who to tell it to, or whether Dominic was actually capable of receiving it. When Pietro had quietly reached out through an old channel, the old man had come forward. The name he gave was Renato. Dominic sat with that for 24 hours. Not because he was surprised, he had suspected it for a long time, but because 20 years is a long time, and even men who have been betrayed before take a moment to feel the particular weight of a betrayal that has a history attached to it. They had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes, in low voices, while Rosa kept the children occupied in the other part of the house. Pietro had been careful and patient and had quietly maintained certain relationships that Dominic now needed. He had also, without being asked, been building a record, dates, amounts, names, of the things that had happened in Dominic's absence. He called Giulio next. Giulio, who had slipped a note under the door and then waited in anxiety for 3 weeks, was so relieved to hear Dominic's voice, actual voice, clear, not confused, not diminished, that he had trouble speaking for a moment. "I didn't know who to trust," Giulio said. "I didn't know what was—" "You trusted the right person," Dominic said. "That's enough. Now listen carefully." He called 3 other men. These were people outside the immediate circle, people who had worked with his family for years, but who reported to Dominic directly and independently, not through Renato. People who had been quietly cut out of things in his absence and who were, as a result, neither loyal to Renato nor afraid of him in the way that the inner circle had become. By the end of that evening, the outline of what needed to happen was clear. It was not going to involve a dramatic confrontation. It was not going to be loud. Dominic had never been interested in drama. Drama was what happened when men were more interested in how they looked than in what they were actually doing. He was interested in outcomes. The first thing he dealt with was Juliana. He had her brought to the room, asked Rosa to let her know he needed to speak with her, which was unusual enough to get her attention. When she came in, she was composed, perfectly dressed, carrying a faint anxiety she was trying to hide. Dominic looked at her, not through dark glasses, without them. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. Her husband, sitting in the wheelchair but with clear eyes, looking directly at her. She went very still. "Sit down, Juliana," he said. She sat. What followed was one of the quietest conversations Dominic could remember having. He told her what he knew. He told her what he could prove. He told her what he was willing to offer: a settlement, a formal separation, her freedom, and his silence about certain financial movements she had made. And he told her what the alternative to accepting the offer looked like. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman. She accepted. "I want the children to stay," Dominic said. This was the one point that was not negotiable, and both of them knew it. Juliana nodded. She had never been particularly good at this part of parenting, the physical, daily, constant presence of it. She loved the children in the way people love things they admire from a distance. She was not going to fight for them. She probably felt some relief, though she would never say it. She was gone within 48 hours. She did not say goodbye to Luca and Nino. She left while they were at school. Dominic noted this. He filed it alongside 100 other things he had filed over the past years, in the space in his mind reserved for information that had finished being surprising. Renato was the more complicated matter. Not because Dominic did not know what to do. He knew exactly what to do. It was complicated because of the weight of it. 20 years of history, of a relationship that had been genuinely productive, and for much of that time, something that resembled friendship. But the route that only 3 people had known, and the doctor, and the glass. Dominic chose a place Renato would recognize, a restaurant in the south of the city, a place they had used for meetings for over a decade. He sent a message through Giulio that there was a matter that needed to be discussed, that Dominic had been having some moments of clarity and needed to see certain people. Renato came. He walked through the door of the restaurant, past the usual tables, to the private room in the back, and stopped. Dominic was standing. No wheelchair, no dark glasses, a suit, not the one he would have worn before, because he had lost weight, but a suit, standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the street. He turned when Renato came in. Renato's face did something complicated and then went still. They looked at each other for a moment. "Sit down, Renato," Dominic said. What happened in the next hour was not shouting. It was not threats. Dominic laid out what he knew, calmly, clearly, the way a man who has had 3 months to prepare a conversation can do. He named dates. He named amounts. He named the restaurant where the relevant conversation had been overheard. Renato did not deny it. He had enough self-respect for that at least. What he said, after a long silence, was, "I thought you were finished." "I know," Dominic said. I didn't want you to." Renato stopped. He seemed to be looking for words and not finding the right ones. "You thought I was finished," Dominic said again. "So you acted accordingly. I understand it. I'm not going to tell you I understand it the way you want me to understand it. But I understand it." He told Renato what was going to happen. He was being removed from his position. He was not being further punished. This was not generosity exactly. It was calculation. Renato had been loyal for 15 years before the ambush. 15 years of genuine, reliable, useful loyalty. Dominic was not willing to erase 15 years because of 6 weeks of opportunism, and he was also not stupid enough to believe that publicly destroying Renato would make the people around him feel safer. It would make them feel less safe. It would tell everyone that there was no room for error, no room for history, no room for the complexity that came with being human. Renato accepted this. He looked older walking out than he had walking in. Dominic stood at the window for a few minutes after he left, watching the street, not thinking about anything in particular. Then he put his jacket on and went home. Dr. Conti was handled differently, and through different channels, in a way that did not require Dominic's direct involvement, and that would not be described here, because it did not need to be. He was no longer anyone's doctor. That was the outcome. 3 days after the meeting with Renato, on a Wednesday morning, Dominic walked into the kitchen. Not rolled, walked. Rosa was at the counter, making tea. She had her back to the door. She heard the footsteps, and turned. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. Then she turned back to the counter. "I'll make enough for the boys," she said. "They'll want breakfast when they wake up." "Yes," Dominic said. He sat at the kitchen table. Not at the head of it, just at the table, the way anyone sits at a kitchen table in the morning. Rosa put the kettle on and got out 3 more cups. "Rosa," Dominic said. She looked at him. The glass, the water glass. Every evening for, how long? Rosa was quiet for a moment. "About 5 weeks," she said. He nodded slowly. "You didn't say anything to anyone." "It wasn't my business to say anything to anyone," she said. "It was my business to make sure you had a clean glass." He thought about this. "You could have done nothing. It would have been the safer thing." Rosa picked up the kettle and poured water into the pot. "I've been in many houses," she said, which was her way of not answering the question, and also of answering it completely. Dominic nodded once. From upstairs came the sound of small feet landing on a floor. Nino, who always woke up by jumping out of bed rather than climbing out of it, as though every morning required a launch. "He's going to want to know," Rosa said, nodding upward. "I know," Dominic said. Nino appeared in the doorway a minute later, hair sideways, pajamas, eyes still half asleep. He looked at Rosa. He looked at the cups on the counter. He looked at his father, sitting at the kitchen table. Sitting, not in the wheelchair, at the table. Nino stared at him for a long moment. "I told you," Nino said. Dominic looked at his son. "What did you tell me?" "That you were going to stand up," Nino said, perfectly matter of fact. "I drew it. The one on the wall." "I know. I saw it." "You can see?" Nino asked, blinking. "Yes," Dominic said. "I can see." Nino considered this with the seriousness of someone receiving a scientific confirmation. "Good," he said. Then he climbed into the chair next to his father and waited for breakfast. Luca came downstairs 10 minutes later, already dressed for school. He saw his father at the table and stopped walking. He stood in the doorway and did not speak. Dominic looked at him. Luca walked to the table, sat down, and very carefully put his hand over his father's hand, the same way he had been doing on the visits. The same gesture, the same quiet steadiness. Then he went back to eating breakfast. He did not ask any questions. He did not need anything explained. His father was at the table. That was enough. Dominic understood, watching his sons eat breakfast, that this was the difference. People who need something from you ask questions. People who simply love you don't need the explanation. They just move forward. He sat with Rosa in the kitchen after the boys went to school. He had written a letter, actually written it by hand, which he had not done since he was a young man, and he slid it across the table to her. She picked it up and read it. It was not long. It said that he knew she had been taking care of him in a way that had nothing to do with her job description and everything to do with who she was. It said that she would be receiving a significant increase in her pay going forward, and that her position in the house was secure for as long as she wanted it. And it said, this was the part she read twice, that he was grateful in a way he did not know how to say out loud, which was why he was writing it down. Rosa folded the letter carefully. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Ferrante. I was just doing what needed doing." "I know," he said. "That's exactly the point." She put the letter in the pocket of her apron and stood up and began to clear the cups from the table. He did not try to help, and she did not ask him to. This was also a kind of normalcy that felt, in its small way, like something being restored. The months after that were not perfect. Life did not become simple because the crisis had passed. There were still things to untangle, people to deal with, a structure to rebuild with more honest foundations. His legs took time, real time, proper rehabilitation, a lot of mornings that were harder than he would have liked to admit. He walked with a slight unevenness for about 4 months, that he refused to let become a reason to stop walking. Juliana was gone. The children knew this, in the way children know things. Not fully, not with adult understanding, but with a kind of instinct that filed it under how things are now. Rosa took up more of the everyday care, and she did so naturally, without anyone asking her to, without changing her manner or pretending she was something she was not. She was still the person who made sure the school bags were ready, and that Nino's pasta was the right shape, and that the hallway light was left on at night, because both boys, it turned out, were still a little afraid of the dark, and there was nothing wrong with that. Luca did eventually get the dog. It was large and very badly behaved, and ate 2 pairs of shoes in the first month. Nino named it Torpedo because it ran into things. Dominic, who had never lived with a dog and was privately uncertain about the whole arrangement, found within about 2 weeks that Torpedo had somehow appointed himself Dominic's shadow and followed him from room to room with the dedicated intensity of a very small bodyguard who had no actual skills. He did not object to this. There is a particular moment he thought about sometimes, in the months after everything. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a Tuesday evening, the same day of the week as the attack, though he had stopped thinking about that particular coincidence. He was sitting in the garden, which he had not done much of before, because he had not used the garden much before. It was just there, a space at the back of the house, and he had never particularly had time for it. Nino was running in circles for reasons that made sense only to him. Luca was sitting on the wall reading something. Torpedo was lying in the middle of the garden in a patch of late sun, contributing nothing to anyone. Rosa came out with 2 cups of tea, one for herself, which she almost never did. She almost never sat with him, and placed them on the garden table and sat down. They sat in silence for a while. Then Dominic said, "You knew, didn't you, that I could see?" Rosa picked up her cup. "I had a feeling," she said. "From when?" She thought about it. "From the lamp," she said. "The first week. When I asked if you wanted me to leave it on and you didn't answer. But when I left it on, you didn't call anyone to turn it off. A man who can't see doesn't care about a lamp." He looked at her. "I didn't say anything," she added, "because it seemed like you had a reason, and it wasn't my place to ask what the reason was." He thought about that. "You weren't afraid?" he asked. She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has seen quite a lot of life and does not scare easily. "Of what?" she said. He did not have an answer for that. Nino ran past them both, nearly knocking over the tea, and disappeared around the side of the house. Torpedo heaved himself to his feet and followed at a pace that suggested he was not actually in a hurry, but felt obligated to make the effort. Luca looked up from his reading and watched Nino go, then went back to his book. It was a very ordinary scene. Nothing about it would have looked, from the outside, like anything significant. A man and his household staff sitting in a garden. 2 children. A dog that could not run in a straight line. Dominic thought, "I spent 20 years building a structure that fell apart in 6 weeks when I could not hold it up myself. And I spent 3 months pretending to be broken and discovered that the only people who behaved the same, whether I was watching or not, were a 58-year-old woman who cleaned my floors and 2 small children who did not know what I had built or what it cost." He thought, "I do not know what that means about what I built, but I think I know what it means about what matters." He picked up his tea. The sun was going down. Nino could be heard somewhere around the side of the house, narrating something loudly to the dog. Luca turned a page. Rosa finished her tea in silence, stood up, collected the cups, and went back inside. Nino's drawing is still on the wall of the bedroom. The tape has been replaced twice, once by Rosa, once by Dominic himself, on a morning when he noticed a corner had come loose. Nobody asked him to do it. He just noticed it and fixed it. A man with a large round head and tiny arms, standing up, smiling. It is not an accurate portrait. It never was. But the one thing it gets right, the thing a 4-year-old decided to put in the drawing before any of this was resolved, before anyone knew what was going to happen, is the standing and the smile. Dominic is not a man who smiles easily. He has never been. The people who knew him in his years at the top would probably say he was not someone you would associate with warmth. But in the evenings, in the garden, with Torpedo choosing entirely the wrong moment to bark at something, and Luca reading on the wall, and Nino announcing discoveries at full volume, in those evenings, something happens to his face that the people who knew him before would not quite recognize. It is not a large expression. It does not take up much space, but it is there.